President Trump is using money to push through an overhaul of US academia. He's withdrawing, or threatening to withdraw, billions of dollars in research grants and other aid from universities unless they change how they're run. The moves have put universities' endowment funds under a spotlight.
With Harvard, they have $53 billion in a fund, and yet they want more grants. And it looks like we're not going to be giving them any more grants, right, Linda?
So what exactly is a university endowment? What's it used for? And how easily can university bosses access it to cover funding shortfalls? Let's find out. It's what we do here on Reuters Econ World. Every week, we pick a phrase or buzzword and go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. So this week, endowments. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins in Dublin. Endowments are money or other financial assets, think gold, stocks, bonds, donated to an academic institution. Any student of classics will tell you that they have a long pedigree. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius created the first recorded endowed professorships in Athens in the 2nd century. But in the modern era, American universities have really run with the concept. The country's 8 Ivy League schools have billions of dollars in their endowments, with Harvard right at the top with $53 billion. Now, that's not representative of all US colleges. Most have far less in their nest eggs. In fact, 30% of participants in a recent survey carried out by the National Association of College and University Business Officers had endowments of $100 million or less. Most endowment spending is on student financial aid. But universities don't get free rein over how they get to use their endowments. Donors will often restrict how the schools spend their money, and universities typically stick to the principle that the amount donated should last forever, so you only spend the investment income earned on it. At Harvard, for example, 80% of its endowment fund is restricted for particular purposes, like financial aid, professorships, and scholarships. And generally, its endowment payout range is 5 to 5.5% of its market value. That's still a chunk of change. But it does mean that Harvard and other universities are reliant on the federal government for funding research, leaving them with a hole to fill as the battle with the Trump administration heats up. So to parse where this leaves them, I spoke to Catharine Bond-Hill. She's a former president of Vassar College and an economist whose work focuses on higher education affordability and access. And she currently advises academic institutions as managing director of Ithaca S&R. Okay, so I'm floundering a little bit as to what to call you. I feel like it should be some very esteemed academic title, like, you know, you're an economist, you're a former university president, but you go by Cappy. Where does that name come from?
Well, my name is Catharine, but it's been a nickname that I've had for a very long time. And it was from a slightly deaf great aunt.
Oh.
And it just stuck with the family. So I've always stuck with it. And I only got called Catharine when I was in trouble, which didn't happen very often. So I kind of have a visceral reaction to Catharine.
Got it. You're going to be Cappy the whole way through this podcast. Don't worry.
Okay, great.
So the Trump administration is locked in this battle with universities in the US, Cappy, and Ivy League schools in particular. And they're using the federal purse as a weapon. But is that really a problem for these colleges? Can't they handle the financial hit?
The Ivies have, many of them, not all of them, have very large endowments per student. And they use those funds to support both the undergraduate and graduate education, as well as the research that the institution is undertaking. So if they experience a cutback in federal support, federal dollars, they're going to have to reallocate some of the money that's already committed to something else. And that's going to come out of either supporting students or supporting research. And I personally think that's unfortunate. I think that those two things have supported the incredible growth and innovation that has taken place in the United States over the last 100 years and improved the quality of life for our population, as well as the world's, to be honest.
Why are endowments certainly not for every university, but say, for instance, for the Ivy League colleges, why are endowments so big?
Well, they have accumulated resources over time from both gifts and from, in some cases, savings in the past. And those endowments are then used to spin off income that support the operations of the organization. The appropriate size of an endowment is a hard question. The nonprofit status of universities is in many ways a blunt instrument in terms of supporting the mission of those institutions. So some institutions have accumulated significant endowments, but they support the mission of the organization, allow it to undertake greater research and educate more students, both undergraduates and graduate students.
And they often come with strings attached, right? So when we talk about endowments, it's not just an easy, accessible, pot of gold, right? Can you explain a little bit to our listeners how they work?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit more of a pot of gold than sometimes it's claimed to be.
Okay.
So when donors make contributions to institutions, they will negotiate with the institution on what they would like the money to be spent for. So, for example, they could say they care very much about undergraduate financial aid, and they could dedicate their contribution to the institution to undergraduate financial aid. Those resources, then, the earnings on that endowment can only be spent on that.
Right.
But what that means is that the institution's other sources of revenue, for example, tuition revenue, is unrestricted and can be spent on other things. So money is fungible in the end. And as long as the endowment is earmarked and restricted to spending on things that the institution wants to spend the money on, it gives them some flexibility to use unrestricted money for some other things. Interestingly, when an institution has some savings in a particular year, for example, they could have gotten some unrestricted gifts that they ended up not using, the Board of Trustees can actually move money to the endowment, and it's called funds functioning as endowment. Those resources can be removed from the endowment and spent at the Board of Trustees' discretion. So in Harvard's case, for example, almost 25% of the endowment is funds functioning as endowment, and that will give the institution some flexibility to spend that money maybe over the next couple of years as it addresses the challenge from the administration.
What about donations that aren't funneled to the endowment? Harvard saw an increase in those in its last fiscal year, despite seeing a drop in endowment gifts.
Those tend to depend a little bit on what's going on in the economy.
Mm-hmm.
So most institutions, in addition to looking to get donors to give to the endowment, will rely on, I think of it as the annual fund. And I know that institutions in Europe have instituted similar efforts to get alumni to contribute gifts. And that tends to go along with the economy. If families are very uncertain about how the economy is going to play out over the next year, generally you'll see a little bit of a slowdown in that kind of giving.
So does that mean that we're expecting donations perhaps to fall this year? Because there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about the global economic outlook.
It'll be interesting to see. I think it could go both ways. I do think one of the things that's unfortunate is that higher education has become so politicized. And I do think that means that alums on both sides of the political aisle either may give more or may give less, just depending on how their institution responds to what's going on.
In terms of, the philanthropy and the endowment funds, universities are increasingly reliant on them, aren't they, for their operations?
The American system is wonderfully diverse, which means that there are all kinds of different ways in which someone can go on to post-secondary education. Not that many schools have large endowments. I think something like 3 or 4 institutions account for 25% of the endowment funds out there. And another, if you get up to about 15 institutions, it accounts for a very large share of those endowment funds.
Wow.
The schools that have endowments, they use the earnings on that endowment to support their spending. And it can be up to 30-40% of their operating budgets. But many, many institutions are tuition-driven and really rely on the payments of their students to cover their operating costs.
Right.
And those institutions have a lot less financial flexibility. And as families have more trouble paying tuition, it puts those institutions in a tough situation.
One of the things about university endowments that I thought might make a good real-world example for this show is a look at how they invest. because it's notable how much of their assets are invested in things like private equity, venture capital, hedge funds. These are things that are sometimes called alternative assets. In the case of Harvard, they represented over 70% of its portfolio in its last fiscal year. The shift away from traditional bonds and equities by some big American universities started in the 1980s. David Swenson, the former head of Yale University's Nest Egg, pioneered the so-called endowment model. It's since been copied by other investors like family offices, sovereign wealth funds, and big pension funds. Cappy explains the rationale for universities.
Since these institutions are essentially thinking about existing in perpetuity and don't need to draw down on the assets in the endowment every year, they just need to use the earnings. There was a shift towards investing the endowment in an appropriately diversified set of assets that weren't driven by generating dividends and interest. And so funds, then investment managers, moved towards trying to get a higher rate of return, subject to a certain amount of risk.
Yeah.
They didn't want to get so risky that they, bet the farm on something, right?
Right.
But they could definitely move out of T-bills and publicly traded stocks, which were lower returns and safer, more liquid. They didn't need that liquidity because they just needed a small bit of the earnings on the endowment. Now, in the last financial crisis, some schools found that they had gotten themselves a little bit too illiquid. And then, when that crash was almost, I think, a 28 to 30% reduction in the value of the endowments. That created some problems for institutions generating the liquidity. But most institutions learned from that and realized that they needed to pay attention not only to the long-run return, managing risk, but also managing enough liquidity to get through a down market.
I mean, fast forward to today, it's a different type of crisis. But for some of these universities, they may need to access cash now more quickly. And that can be a problem if you've tied up your assets in hedge funds and venture capital and PE.
I suspect that having learned from the financial crisis with the Great Recession, that more institutions have made sure they're paying attention to liquidity issues, and that will serve them well here. I have also heard that several institutions have actually done some borrowing, and that will generate some liquidity to get through whatever this period may be.
So you think the Ivy League schools have the financial firepower to deal with this battle they're facing?
I think they have the financial power and they have the legal chops to question some of the policies. Now, that's not to say that elite and selective higher education and higher education in America more generally is doing everything right. I think, in fact, the Trump administration channeled into a sense of unhappiness on the part of the public. They didn't pull this out of nowhere. And I think there are a couple of things that are really quite challenging. One is that the schools with the most resources have the fewest low-income students. And so the lower-income students don't see this as a route for them to attain higher education. And so they don't see it as part of their choice set. So that's one thing. And then if you go outside of the Ivies, I think this still relates to what's going on with the attack on higher education. Institutions in the United States, both the costs have gone up and the graduation rates haven't been very high. So families understand that higher education is really important. They know they probably can't get into the Ivies, who only accept like 5 or 6% of their applicants. So that seems out of reach.
Right.
And then the other institutions aren't doing that great a job of actually graduating students. So if you borrow money and you don't graduate, you don't get the benefits. And in the United States right now, there are actually almost 44 million people that started higher education, got some credits, but didn't finish. And those are people for whom higher education didn't work out.
And they're left with the debt?
And it's many of those actually young adults or adults will have some debt and won't have the benefits in the labor market of having actually gotten a degree. So that's why I think people are pretty unhappy with higher ed at the moment.
In terms of freezing federal funding for some universities, what exactly does that hit?
Well, the administration has been going after research grants, NIH and NSF grants, and that immediately slows access to resources for researchers who were counting on that money to continue their work. I think that's really unfortunate because some projects, it may essentially destroy them, if you can't keep going. again, I think some institutions will try to protect those investments to make sure that things don't just completely grind to a halt. But in the United States, our productivity and innovation has been driven really since after World War II by this essentially agreement between the government and the universities that research would be supported by the federal government. And so I do worry that that's going to really put a damper on innovation going forward, which will affect the economy.
The Trump administration has threatened to pull Harvard's tax-exempt status. What is so important about that status for universities in general?
Yeah, so that's an interesting threat. It will be complicated to make happen because the tax-exempt status of organizations is in legislation. So I'm not sure that he actually has the power to do this without amending the tax legislation. But I think one of the major benefits of that tax-exempt status is that contributions to 501c3s, which are these tax-exempt institutions, get a tax preference. And so it will make donations, large donations on the part of very wealthy individuals, less tax advantaged. And so it could affect the donations to the institution.
Right.
So that would be, it would have an impact on one of their revenue streams, institutions' revenue streams.
And an important revenue stream.
An important one.
Yeah.
Colleges and universities don't make money. They generally lose money.
Yeah.
So the actual tax implication on the institution itself is something that I think we still have to think through and how that would work. But it's the incentive for donations that I think is the big one.
Any final words of advice to university presidents out there?
I think it's really important that higher education take a look at why the public is so unhappy with them and be proactive at trying to address those issues and understand why they've become so politicized and address those issues. I think some of the challenges from the administration are not focused on those issues, and higher education should be. I've been talking about a goal of higher education leaders over the next couple of years should be to make sure they have more friends when we come out the other side of this.
Cappy, thank you so much for your time.
Happy to do it.
Thanks again to Cappy for her time and insights. You can keep up to date on the fight between the Trump administration and US universities on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. We also had a recent podcast all about it on Reuters World News. I'll put a link to that episode in the description of today's show. Sound design, music composition and engineering on this episode was by Alex Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Josh Summer, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Christopher Wall-Jasper, Jonah Green, David Spencer and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.